Welcome to the Nerd Party.
Hi, this is Nick Anastasiou, story editor on Star Wars The Clone Wars and Star Wars Bad Batch. And you are listening to Aggressive Negotiations.
Hello and welcome to Aggressive Negotiations, coming at you from the seat of the Star Wars Galaxy Coruscant. And I am just one of your hosts here, Matthew Rushing, and I'm so excited to have with me, that super sexy pheromone Greekin man, John Mills.
Well, I must say it's something that I treasure is my ability to apparently exude Spanish fly at whim. It's maybe a little creepy when you really think about it, but let's not think about it, Matt. Let's not think about it.
No, let's not. Let's not. So we're excited to be here because it's been 26 years since Shadows of the Empire has come out, and that is what we're going to talk about today. So we've gone back and read the book.
Yeah.
And I'm really excited to be able to do this with you, John. But before we get there, of course, people can find us all over the place. Wherever you get your podcasts, you'll want to make sure you're subscribed so you get the show as soon as it drops. And, if you're on like a Spotify or Apple Podcast and you can give us a star rating or review, please do. Help people find the show. You can also follow us at the Jedi Masters, as well as the entire network, at Join Nerd Party. You can also find us on Instagram at thenerdparty.com. At the Nerd Party. We're online at thenerdparty.com. And of course, if you wanted to send us an email, you can do that in the contact section. So John, Shadows of the Empire, is this a book that, like, when it first came out, that you bought it and read it? Because obviously it was a multimedia extravaganza.
Oh, yeah.
An experience.
I was all over it. It's the official story of what happened between The Empire Strikes Back and Return of the Jedi. I struggle to think of anybody in my circle that wasn't excited, or at least pretended to be excited because I was excited about it. And they all knew that I would buy the book and they could borrow it from me. So my one sale was 6 people reading the book. But I was all on board. This is when they renewed the action figure line, and we got the weirdly shaped figures that were very odd.
The ultra buff Power of the Force line.
Yeah, those were weird. But and you had the N64 game. You had, and I remember them selling it. This is the movie. It's just missing a movie. And I think even at the time, being conscious of the fact that this was their test marketing run for what was going to come with the prequels. They were testing the markets, figuring out what it would withstand, what it would uphold. So I was all on board with this. Got the hardcover immediately when it was released on the day of. And back then, kids, that meant going to the store and walking in and hoping they had a copy.
Yeah. Like a Walden's book or something.
Walden Books, B. Dalton Bookseller.
Yeah.
Going to the mall and walking into that store and hoping they ordered enough copies was an exciting adventure. I was on top of it. And the soundtrack, I was all about the soundtrack too, by Joel McNeely, which we talked about on an earlier episode. So
we did.
Was Shadows of the Empire something that entered your orbit at the time, or was this still something? Because I think your first theatrical experience was the special editions. So would you have even been excited about this at the time?
Oh, I was pumped.
Really?
Because, I had gotten into the literature because of Heir to the Empire, and that had been 91. So I was very much following what was coming out Star Wars book-wise at this point, because it was the only place to get new Star Wars. And so I was very excited when this came out. Now, I never got to play the video game at all, but I did get to hear the soundtrack, borrowing it from the library once it was available. And that lets you know how long ago this was. And, of course, reading the book. And absolutely, I mean, and like you said, and I remember as a kid, my friends and I had all seen Star Wars, right, on VHS. And we started writing our own stories about what had happened. And this is that story. Like, this is where we were writing stories, was what happened after, episode 5, before episode 6. So Now we finally got that. So going back to it now, one, I want to ask you this, just it might be a weird question to ask right now. How do you feel like this book holds up after all this time?
Not terribly well. I would say that of the multimedia experience, the book was something I always liked and I still like, but was never nuts about. I didn't care for the Bothans thing. I didn't think that was executed particularly well. I didn't care for Guri at the time. I've probably changed my opinion on Guri with this read through. And Shizor was always an interesting villain, but even with the more limited galaxy that existed before the prequels of Emperor and Vader, stormtroopers and Imperial military, and not anything really beyond that in the movies, Shizor felt odd. But the one thing I picked up on, and I want to get your read on this, I think that there's that desire to explore the underworld all the way back then. So it's sort of in the Lucasfilm mind at the time. You have the corporate sector back during the Han Solo adventures. You have the underworld during here. We're re-entering the underworld. We had 1313, that abandoned project. So the underworld seems to have always been something that has been an obsession with Lucasfilm. Do you think that helps it retain some of its resonance as we come back and reread it here?
I absolutely do. I think you've really nailed the thing that makes this book work at all, which is a lot of the ideas get fleshed out in other places, and they may get fleshed out in a much better way. But I mean, I think this book kind of starts a lot of those wheels turning for people, which is, like you said, the underworld. Seeing that there is this the crime syndicate idea as being, next to the Empire, the only other real power in the galaxy, and even just the thought process of the fact that this would absolutely be something that Palpatine would be willing to use, because it does fuel the dark side, right? All of this underhanded dealing, all slavery, all of these things are things to which help fuel the dark side rising in the galaxy. And so greed, all of that type of stuff, this is exactly what he wants. And so to be using somebody like a Black Sun and a Shizor, I think 100% makes sense. And whether or not the execution is 100% successful, I think is a little bit besides the point when you think of what this book does for the legacy of Star Wars and the things that we're seeing now. Even Lucas himself, his desire was to do that underworld show. And had 50 scripts written and was, just waiting for technology to kind of catch up so that he could do it. I just think that's really incredible. And I can't imagine that this wasn't maybe something to which he gave a little bit of insight into saying, go play with, the underworld a little bit, with the book. As that, like you said, just to test the waters to kind of see how things work, because I feel like a lot of the EU was that for him. He was not afraid to see how things were responded to, and if it was a good idea, he would use it. We've seen that many a times with what he did with the Clone Wars with Dave, and then what Dave has continued to do. So, yeah, I think to me, whether asking the question of how it holds up, I think you kind of hit on the more interesting question is the legacy this book has left, regardless of whether the actual book itself does hold up.
It's interesting because Shizor as a villain, I think it's a great name. And I remember reading something at the time about the fact that somebody, when they were trying to think of a name for the character, I don't think it was Steve Perry, the author, but it was somebody who was just fascinated by the XI she sound and finding a way. And I think the combination wound up being taking that and then the word razor and putting them together. And I like that. The hurdle I have with it, I think might even in this reread B, with the fact that so much terrific character work was done by Filoni and crew in the Clone Wars, and even extending to Solo: A Star Wars Story, which you and I sing the praises of all the time. I can't help but compare Shizor to Maul, to Dryden Voss, to the Pikes, to these other great criminal elements that we've been exposed to. And Shizor feels closer to Zero the Hutt than to Dryden Voss.
Well, yes. I'm so glad you mentioned me.
It's so wonderful. But, and the thing is, I like Zero as a character. I'm not saying it because I dislike Zero. I'm saying that, I mean, did you have the same struggle I did, which is I'm reading Shizor and I'm like, this is sort of like this is a backbencher. I don't buy that this guy runs Black Sun. Even though they make a big thing about how he can control his emotions and everything, he's not cold enough. He's not there. Am I wrong about that?
This might sound weird, but yeah, he does kind of come off as a sleazy, horny teenager.
Yeah.
Like you said, he doesn't have the coldness that you'd want, and he doesn't, in the end, feel as smart as you would want him to be somebody who is challenging like a Vader or the Emperor at all. He's trying to play those two, and the Emperor knows the whole time that he's trying to be and Vader's not even really falling for it. And if you're not getting Vader to kind of fall for it, like he just doesn't ever come off as a legitimate rival at all. And that's, I think, the thing that you would want more of, because otherwise he is just kind of a creeper.
Yeah, we'll come back to that one, but I think you hit on a very important point there in that Perry seems a little bit lost. I don't know if it's because of the strictures that are put on him, like the guardrails are a little too tight, but rereading it, it's a much more interesting story if the Emperor does get fooled by Shizor and Vader's the one that wins out in the end, instead of it being, I'm the Emperor and nobody can fool me. Because setting it between Empire and Jedi, it could have acted as a foreshadowing of the fact that the Emperor is so sure of his vision in Return of the Jedi, and that's what undoes him. His overconfidence is his weakness. Yeah. It would have been more interesting to have Shizor really pull the wool over his eyes and Vader be the one to say, see, told you. And that be sort of a beginning for Vader to say, maybe this guy doesn't know as much as he says he does. But additionally, to your point about being a creeper, Shizor's whole thing with his pheromones didn't feel good back then. It feels worse now. But one of the things I'll never forget somebody commenting on in the earliest forums you could get onto on the internet, because I've been on the internet since the early days, kids, all the way back to the Usenet forums. Thank God they don't exist anymore. Although actually that was like Mad Max Beyond Thunderdome compared to what you all go through with Twitter. So, whatever. But I don't care how much natural sexual charisma somebody has. Leia's in love with Han.
Yeah.
It doesn't matter what pheromones Shizor has. They would basically be
right.
And I know maybe that's a romantic side of me saying, oh no, that wouldn't happen. But I think maybe the thing that bothers me in addition to that is the fact that it's not that Leia is strong enough to resist Shizor. It's that Chewie has to come and quote unquote save her. And in a way, it diminishes Leia. And that's not the path that Leia is on through the 3 original movies. Am I off base on that?
What's interesting here, I think, is that you have Leia, who is still confused between her, Luke, and Han in this book. And I think that's where they legitimize the idea that Shizor's pheromones could work for a while, until it's like that awakening of realizing what's happening. And then once that happens, like, and her kind of like, no, I'm in love with Han, or, I care for Han, and it allows her to be able to move forward and not be affected anymore. I think is interesting. I think the problem is, and you rightly just called out, is that it just feels strange because you've got this character who's doing all of this to save someone. And, she's literally sacrificing her life to try and save Han. And I don't know. Yeah, it just feels off. It just doesn't feel right. And so, and yeah, I think, I don't know if it's just the times have changed, but yeah, the sexuality stuff here is just, it's way over the top and not in a good way.
I don't think it's just that the times have changed. It felt weird back in the 90s too. And I think we're approaching it from two separate angles, but I think we agree with each other. Like, it just doesn't hold up. And I think part of the issue is that this is supposed to be the novelization of a movie that does not exist. So the ultimate measure of success is I should believe that this is based on a movie.
Yeah, that's a good point.
I don't believe that this is based on a movie. I don't see a Star Wars movie here. I've read the novelizations of all of the first 6 films. I actually read the novelization of The Force Awakens as well and gave up after that. But eventually I'll get to the other 2. Don't worry. I read the Solo novelization as well.
Which was great, actually.
Yeah, it was. But there's a difference here. It doesn't feel like a novelization. I don't know if there's something where they maybe should have written... I don't know what the process was. But it doesn't feel like a novelization. It feels like a book that was never a movie. And this should feel like a movie, like he wrote this based on a script sort of thing.
Part of that, I think, and I will ding the book on another side, which is the dialogue many times does not feel like the characters. There's too much dialogue in this book that doesn't feel like what we would expect them to sound like, and I think that's also a problem when you're trying to be this kind of undone movie. It just doesn't work, right? And so what's weird is that on the other side, there's a lot of interesting stuff I think that happens here. You said you didn't like the whole thing with the Bothans. I mean, they literally just take lines from Return of the Jedi and make them come to life here, which I thought was relatively interesting. But this is also one of those things where every single thing that needs to happen to get you to Return of the Jedi happens in this book. Whereas you get the feeling from the film, and I think we even know from chronology-wise, there's about a year.
Yeah.
So this doesn't feel like a year, and it doesn't feel like, and that's the thing where I'm saying, like, every single thing that you need to have happen for the next movie happens here, and it just feels like it's all done too much in one movie.
I still
or
go
one book as it is.
I still go back and forth as well. I don't know that I subscribe to the idea of a year between the movies. I do think that Empire and Jedi work a lot better, more compressed than that. But that's a personal preference sort of thing, whatever. But I do think that there is the problem I have with the Bothans thing isn't that it happens, isn't that it's particularly poorly done per se. It's that I think it's more interesting if you make the storylines work together better, so that it winds up being something where you have Vader go out, right, at one point, and he says, this isn't really sport. Luke is sport. This is not sport. Well, let's compress this and have Vader there when they're trying to steal the plans, because the Emperor has messed with Vader and put him there to see what he does, and maybe give us a moment where he has Luke dead to rights and he doesn't pull the trigger. Sort of the way that, even though The Last Jedi is not a particularly good movie, I do like the moment where Ben can't pull the trigger. That would have been an interesting moment here of Vader not able to pull the trigger on Luke and sort of beating himself up about it and being like, well, why couldn't I do it? Why couldn't I kill him? And that plays into Return of the Jedi, where Luke says, you couldn't kill me before. I don't believe you can kill me now. Because it proves that not just Empire, but then Vader encounters him again and he can't kill him. Mm-hmm. That would explain Luke's cockiness in the moment of like, yeah, no, I know you can't do this. This isn't in you. And so I don't know. I mean, it seems... I think we're both getting at the fact that the book feels a little too perfunctory, I guess, right? As opposed to truly flowing in the story.
Mm-hmm. Well, and another thing, too, I feel like the book, one of the things is that by the end, Luke has, like, embraced himself, you know, as a Jedi. And the interesting thing is that I don't get the feeling like through the book he should be able to make that decision at the end, because I don't feel like enough has happened to him for that metamorphosis to have happened. You know, I mean, it's interesting to see him make his lightsaber here. It's weird that the cover has him have a yellow lightsaber, even though it makes a distinction in the book that it's green. So that's odd.
Yeah.
You know, but... And again, I do think that that's like those are kind of neat things that happen in the book. But yeah, it's just, I think what it is, like you said, there's this kind of perfunctory nature to the book. Like this, it's like checking boxes of things that need to happen. And instead of it feeling like interesting interweaving of things, to where I come across like, man, I always thought it would be really interesting to know what happened, but wow, that was really cool, you know, and none of that really happens here. And, you know, it's, again, I think that there's a lot of things in this book that posit some interesting ideas, and a lot of things that I think I see and I'm like, oh man, that's a great idea. And if you had worked it like this, and this, that would have been so much better. And it's just really the execution of the book that comes across as just not being good enough. I mean, I hate to say it, but it's just not good enough.
You know, I think that's fair. I think that it's possible that they were just too production timeline focused. I've been meaning for the last several decades to actually read something else by Mr. Perry to see what compromises he made in terms of his own personal style, and those sorts of things. I honestly think that this is a book that is caught between two worlds. And I think that your comment, I think that your observations bring me to why it was easier for me to let go of the EU when Disney erased it. And what they did afterward, that we can debate that, till we're blue in the face sort of thing. But this book typifies the EU to me, in that that's an interesting concept. That's a neat idea. I'm not sure if I would have done it that way. So it's very close, and it's something that I think is cool, but it's not as cool as I think it should be, or it's not. If I were an editor or if I were an executive, I know the notes I would have given to tweak this, make it a little bit cooler, make it work a little bit better. So that's sort of where I am with it.
Yeah, I think that definitely just makes a lot of sense. And I think it is one of those things where, you know, the story, there's some really good aspects to it, and you just wish that it followed through on all of that. And, in the end, I think it still is an interesting read, and I think there's still some fun to it, which is great. I guess I'm actually really interested, going back and watching it, going back and reading this here. What in the world would you rate this now?
Kindly. When I came to my final rating on Goodreads, which is owned by Amazon but does not give me half-star capabilities, which annoys me, but I understand there are some who feel, well, why don't you just have 10 stars then? Okay, that's fair. This is like on a 10-point scale. Probably I wind up, in all honesty, with a 2.5 out of 5. It's fine. I don't regret reading it. I'm okay with it. There are things I give notes on. But because of, if I have to stick on the whole star scale, then I wind up giving it a 3. And I know that at least part of that is informed by nostalgia, because I remember that it takes me back to when I was a younger man and had fewer cares in the world other than what happened between Empire Strikes Back and Return of the Jedi. So I'll go ahead and give it the 3 on the Goodreads scale. 3 out of 5. What about you?
I'm right there with you, because this was a 3 when I looked back at it, and it stays that way. And I think mainly, like you said, it's like, it's not a 2. It's probably more like a 2.5. But I think rereading it and seeing all the places to which this book, I think, in some ways may have actually inspired ideas for people, is really interesting. And, there's some things in here that are kind of cringe-worthy, but there's also some stuff in here that is fun. And like you said, I don't hate rewatching it. So yeah, this is a decent book. It's not great, but it's decent. And I think that there are some things in here to which it helped inspire, which is really neat. The fact that you can kind of look back and say, oh my gosh, wow, I can totally see why they did that here in the Clone Wars, or that kind of thing comes up in a Mandalorian or the Bad Batch, or, like you can definitely see that stuff, which is really cool.
Just as a parting note before we go, we've heard some back and forth about why Lord and Miller's cut of Solo was rejected. One of them being with the portrayal of Dryden Voss, which the great departed actor who played him mentioned it was a lot more sexual than the way that it was portrayed in the final version of the film. Do you think we would have gotten a more Shizor type character in Solo had Lord and Miller remained, given what we know?
That is really interesting. And I mean, it makes sense when you look at, I think, most popular filmmaking these days. This is not the 90s anymore, in the sense that a lot of people have gone away from, hypersexualized things. It just isn't there, and the one thing I can think of in pop culture in the last 10 years that didn't shy away from that came from a book series, and that was the Game of Thrones series. Yeah. So, and even as it went on, it got less and less so. I think probably, for a Star Wars thing as well, it just, they don't want to go there like that. Star Wars sexuality is always just been barely a minor undercurrent. I mean, the sexiest thing that's happened in Star Wars is Princess Leia and Return of the Jedi, so... in the sense of like just blatant, like almost like sex appeal, it seems like.
And let's keep it that way.
So, yeah. So anyway, yeah. And I think what it also shows too is just in the end, like Star Wars is not about that. Like this is a story about good and evil. It's not a story about like that type of thing. We have many other places to enjoy that. There's no reason to, do that here. So yeah, I'm glad that they didn't go that way with Solo. I also think Dryden Voss was much more terrifying because there was a slight undercurrent that he's controlling Kira, and there's maybe a hint that that's also part of it. But at the same time, he's just terrifying because it's not so explicit. It's just more everything lives in your mind, and what you make up in your mind is probably 20 times worse than anything that could actually show you.
I would offer that Dryden Voss is what Shizor should have been.
Yes.
Which is, I don't know whether I'm going to live through this conversation with him. So all that to say, everybody should rewatch Solo: A Star Wars Story when they get the chance, because it's a wonderful, wonderful film, one of the best Star Wars films. And they should also, Matt, reach out to you online. So where can they find you out there, and where else can they hear your voice out there on the wilds of the internet?
Oh, my goodness. Well, you can find me all over social media under the name MattRushing02. So that's Twitter, Instagram, Letterboxd, Vero, pretty much any social media platform I'm on, and that's my name. You can also find me here on the network. I did a Finish show with Drea Kaufman, and we talked about every single chapter of the Harry Potter series, one chapter at a time, in a show called Owl Post. And then over on the TFM network, I'm doing a bunch of shows. One is called the 602 Club, which we talk about all of the fandoms that we love under one roof. We've got a couple of bonus shows that John and I do, whether that's Snyder Cuts, talking about the work of Zack Snyder, or we are doing Assembling Avengers as we walk through all of the Marvel films together. So you get that all in one feed. You can also find me over there doing a few other shows. One is The Orb. There's Warp 5, Literary Checks, and The Artificial Tango. The Orb is about Star Trek Deep Space Nine. Warp 5 is about Star Trek Enterprise. Literary Treks is about the books and the comics of Star Trek, and The Artificial Tango is about Star Trek Picard. Now, John, if people want to, catch up and see what you're doing as you lounge in your bath waiting for Guri to bring you a drink, where can people find you?
Wow, that's really uncomfortable. Wow. Okay. Let's move on from that. You can find me as Kessel Junkie online, KESSELJUNKIE, Letterboxd and Goodreads. That's a lot of fun. I watch bad movies. I read controversial books. Might be a lot of fun to encounter me on those platforms over there. And you can find me here on the network co-hosting House Lights with Darren Moser and Tristan Riddell, where we look at the works of different directors and go through their filmographies through different categories. And, of course, appearing on Snyder Cuts and Assembling Avengers over on the 602 Club feed on TFM. But, Matt, I got to be honest that your pheromones, they're not really affecting me. I think I need to train you in how to use them to your advantage. So let's go on back to the training room at the Jedi Temple for that reason. You know what? That just feels wrong. I can't do that. Let's just close these negotiations.
Negotiations are closed.
Helicopter lightsabers rule.
Join the Nerd Party.